The man known to history as Yevgeny Viktorovich Prigozhin was born on the 1st of June 1961 in the city of St. Petersburg in the Soviet Union, though it was then known as Leningrad, after Vladimir Lenin, the first leader of communist Russia. Prigozhin's father was Viktor Yevgenyevich Prigozhin, a mining engineer who is reported to have died when Yevgeny was 9 years old. The Prigozhins had a history of wartime service, with Yevgeny's paternal grandfather, also named Yevgeny, having served the Soviet Union in World War II at the Battle of Rzhev in the Smolensk area in 1942 and 1943, an engagement issuing from the Battle of Moscow and the attempts by the Red Army to push the Germans back southwestwards towards Belorussia. The male line of Yevgeny's heritage was partly Jewish, as was his subsequent stepfather. His mother was Violetta Kirovna Prigozhin, a hospital nurse in Leningrad. The young Prigozhin learned to ski from his stepfather and soon developed an aspiration to become a cross-country skier. He might well have realized his dream and gone on to become an accomplished skier rather than a demagogic warlord and war criminal, had it not been for an injury which he suffered in his late teens and which put an end to his ambitions to become a professional skier. This occurred while he was studying at boarding school number 62 in Leningrad, which is now the Olympic Reserve College number 1. There, he had been highly rated as a skier, and when he became injured and had to leave the sport, the Krasnogvardievsky District Children's Sports School in the suburbs of Leningrad offered him a coaching position as he left school. Of his youth, we might only speculate that the sudden end to his sporting ambitions might have left Prigozhin embittered. Beyond this, Prigozhin's adolescence also included travel. His great-uncle was a scientist by the name of Yefim Ilyich Prigozhin, who lived in the city of Zhovty Vody in what is now central Ukraine. Yevgeny spent some time living with him there in the 1970s, spending a period working in a uranium mine, where raw materials to power the Soviet Union's nuclear power plants and nuclear arms program were extracted. Prigozhin grew up in Soviet Russia during a peculiar time in the country's fortunes. When the Russian Revolution had begun in 1917, Russia was a poor and underdeveloped nation, with emerging industries in cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, yet it remained remarkably backwards in other parts of its vast territories. Whatever the sins of the Bolshevik regime may have been in the decades that followed, and indeed they were utterly brutal under the 30-year dictatorship of Joseph Stalin between the mid-1920s and his death in 1953, there is no denying that the USSR was pulled into the modern world through the programs of economic development which were initiated during these decades. Thus, in the aftermath of the Second World War, the Soviets were in a position to dominate Eastern Europe and challenge the United States as the world's preeminent superpower. For a time, as countries throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America adopted Leninist Marxism, the Soviets gained the initial upper hand in the space race, and the annual growth rates of the USSR topped 5% annually and eclipsed the United States. It seemed as though the USSR might emerge victorious in the Cold War, but in the course of the 1960s and 1970s, Russia's economy began to stagnate. The period during which Leonid Brezhnev served as General Secretary of the USSR came to be known as the era of stagnation, as the Soviet economy fossilized on the back of a whimsical notion of full employment and a lack of dynamism such as Western countries were displaying in their adoption of new technologies. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, this was leading to a growing restlessness in cities like Moscow and Leningrad. It was in this environment that Prigozhin came of age.
This video is in paid partnership with BetterHelp, the online therapy site used by over 4 million people to help you live a happier, healthier life. Is something interfering with your happiness or preventing you from achieving your goals? Then BetterHelp might be the solution for you. BetterHelp connects you with a credentialed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. With BetterHelp, you can bypass the difficulties associated with face-to-face therapy, as you can have your therapy sessions as a phone call, as a video chat, or even via messaging if you prefer that. Whatever's the most comfortable version of therapy for you. If you think you might benefit from therapy, consider BetterHelp. Click the link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/peopleprofiles. To get started, you'll fill out a questionnaire to help assess your specific needs. And then you'll be matched with your therapist, in most cases within 48 hours or less. People spend hours in the gym every week, so why not give your mind the same kind of attention? You'll be able to schedule therapy sessions at a time that's convenient for you. And if the therapist you're first matched with doesn't feel like the right fit, which can be common when starting therapy, you can easily switch to a new therapist at no additional cost. Clicking the link in the description helps support this channel, and it also gets you 10% off your first month of BetterHelp, so you can connect with a therapist and see if it helps you.
If Prigozhin's teenage years had been ones of some promise as a potential professional skier, then that promise soon devolved into criminality. By 1979, when he was 18 years of age, he was engaged in robberies around Leningrad. He was apparently not the most adept criminal, as within a few months he had been arrested, tried and convicted for the first time, this time for theft, by the Kubishevsky District Court. For a first offence, though, his 2.5-year prison sentence was suspended. Undeterred, early in 1980, Prigozhin joined a more formal criminal gang in Leningrad, one which specialized in robbing the homes of Leningrad's more affluent citizens. It was in this company that he was arrested in 1981 for attacking and robbing a young woman on the streets of the city. When his case came to trial, he was accused of multiple crimes, including having choked the woman who was being robbed, while his 2 associates stole her earrings and winter boots. With his previous suspended sentence taken into account, the court decided a large punishment was in order, and Prigozhin was sentenced to 12 years in a penal colony, with an extra year added on for his earlier suspended sentence. Sentenced in October 1981, he would not be free until October 1994 if his full sentence was imposed. Prigozhin's unwillingness to cooperate with authorities was on full display during his time in prison. For years, he constantly violated prison rules and was regularly sent to solitary confinement, an undesirable scenario in a prison system which had only partly shaken off the brutality of the Stalin-era Gulag prisons. By the mid-1980s, though, he was evidently learning that such obstinate conduct was in his own disinterest, and he began to conform. By 1985, he was returned to the general population of the prison, and thereafter he began to take advantage of his time in confinement, reading extensively and taking courses to acquire various new skills in industry and manufacturing. As a result, when he appeared before the Soviet equivalent of a parole board in the summer of 1988, they noted that he had undertaken extensive efforts to reform himself, and so his sentence would be reduced to 10 years, meaning Prigozhin could now expect to leave prison late in 1991. It was also at this juncture that he requested to be sent to a hard labor camp, which brought with it a small salary, which he could use to set himself up when he was released. The application was granted, and he was transferred to a timber-producing labor camp in the Republic of Komi to the northeast of the Ural Mountains, a district of Russia which is very inhospitable and lies partially within the Arctic Circle. Prigozhin would serve out the remainder of his prison term here. As Prigozhin was serving his time in prison during the 1980s, the Soviet Union was entering into a period of immense change, the greatest seen since the end of the Stalin era in the 1950s. These years saw the United States unquestionably begin to dominate the political system worldwide in a way which highlighted the weaknesses of Russia in a manner previously unseen. For instance, while the Soviet economy continued to stagnate, the Western world emerged from the years of stagflation in the 1970s that had followed from the 1973 oil crisis into an era of remarkable economic growth in the 1980s, as leaders like President Ronald Reagan in the United States and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the UK championed free market economics. Russia's economic malaise was compounded by its embarrassment in Afghanistan, a country which it had invaded in 1979 to prop up a communist regime within, but where it could not gain victory over the Mujahideen religious rebels during the 1980s. All of this led to the new premier of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, to initiate a wide-ranging reform program within the USSR after he rose to power as General Secretary in 1985. But while Gorbachev wanted to reform the Soviet Union, his policies actually led to its collapse in the long run. For instance, he liberalized media communications from 1988 onwards, and this led to people hearing in great detail about the liberties people in the West enjoyed, in contrast to the authoritarianism which people in Eastern Europe had endured for decades. Soon, the USSR began to lose its hold on Eastern Europe. First, the Eastern Bloc countries in places like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, which Russia had dominated since the end of the Second World War, effectively threw off communist rule in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and then the USSR itself began to collapse. In the course of 1991, an attempt by the communist hardliners to re-establish control failed, and then the USSR effectively collapsed into 15 different nation-states, with Ukraine, Belarus and other nations emerging as independent countries. On the 26th of December 1991, the USSR came to an end officially and was replaced by the Russian Federation. For Prigozhin in jail in Russia, this meant that when he was released from prison, he would be entering a world undergoing a transformation from what he had known in the late 1970s and early 1980s as a criminal in Leningrad. He returned to civil society as the Soviet Union was still disintegrating. He had been released even earlier than expected from prison on the 21st of March 1990, with the official explanation on his file being that he had atoned for his crime. Prigozhin headed home to Leningrad, soon to be renamed St. Petersburg, and there began studying at the Leningrad Chemical and Pharmaceutical College. Though he was studying to become a pharmacist, he would never complete the degree. He also began a relationship with a woman named Lyubov Valentinovna, and quickly married her in 1991. They would soon have 3 children together. The eldest was a daughter named Polina, born in 1992, followed by a son, Pavel, in the mid-1990s, and a second daughter named Veronica, born in 2005. Curiously, for a man who is known in retrospect for his brutal mercenary group and war crimes, Prigozhin is known to have produced a children's book in the early 2000s along with his children, one which was never published, but which he had 1,000 copies of printed to distribute to friends and acquaintances. Indra Guzik was a book of fairy tales concerning the residents of the fabled land of King Indraguz, a slightly bizarre and incongruous literary interlude for a notorious war criminal. In 1991, as he married and began to aspire to start a family, Prigozhin abandoned his studies as a pharmacist and instead moved into the culinary field. That year, he started the Contrast Food Store Network and began working as a caterer. While accounts of him often refer to him as rising from being a humble hot dog seller to becoming one of the most powerful individuals in Russia, this is slightly misrepresentative. Prigozhin didn't simply operate a hot dog stand in St. Petersburg. Instead, after a visit to the United States in 1993, during which he observed the fast food culture which prevailed in America and witnessed how successful it was, he returned to Russia and began developing a chain of hot dog stands and kiosks. In an age where communism had collapsed and there was an appetite for all things American in cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, the hot dog business did well, and by 1994 he had over 100 kiosks and had earned his first $1 million. This in turn allowed him to open the Agat Food Manufacturing Factory in 1994, a 6,000 square meter space which produced masses of food every day. Thus, within a few years, Prigozhin was prospering as a mass caterer. One has to understand the politics and economy of Russia in the decade or so following the collapse of the Soviet Union. This was a period of utter anarchy in Russia. Following the end of the USSR, one of the major superpowers of the 20th century had suddenly put everything up for sale. Where the communist regime had owned vast parts of the country's infrastructure and economy, the end of the war led to a fire sale as a market economy was developed. In the short run, this was a disaster for Russia, as the country's economy shrunk by approximately 40% between 1991 and 1998. Violence became endemic across the country as well, as the previous systems of law and order collapsed and political anarchy resulted. All of this was overseen by the inert government of Boris Yeltsin, a former member of the Communist Party who became enormously popular after splitting with Gorbachev in 1987 and establishing himself as the first president of the post-communist Russian Federation. Yeltsin showed promise in his early years as head of state, but by the mid-1990s, it was clear that he was unable to manage the transition to a market-orientated democracy, a factor underlined by his chronic alcoholism. The latter notoriously resulted in Yeltsin being found naked on Pennsylvania Avenue in 1994 while on a presidential trip to Washington, D.C. He infamously explained his naked, drunken state on having gone out to get some pizza. Incredibly, Yeltsin was apprehended leaving the White House again the following night naked and looking for more pizza. But this time the Secret Service intervened before he left the premises. This was the man responsible for overseeing Russia's politics and economy in the 1990s. The upshot of all of this, for some, was that the Russian economy developed or collapsed, depending on which way you look at it, in the 1990s, in a way which created immense opportunities for ruthless and ambitious individuals such as Prigozhin. In the course of the decade, individuals who were able to influence policymakers corruptly acquired huge stakes in Russia's national companies as they privatized. This led to the period that became known for the rise of the oligarchs, individuals who became immensely wealthy and powerful in Russia by asset stripping the country during this period of Yeltsin-managed anarchy. A good example is Roman Abramovich, famously known in the Western world as the owner of Chelsea Football Club between 2003 and 2022, a move which transformed European football as he became the first uber-wealthy owner of a football team that could pour money into the system in pursuit of trophies rather than profit. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, as the Soviet Union began to reform and then collapsed, Abramovich set up numerous small businesses which he used to generate a pool of wealth and political influence. He then utilized this money and influence during the chaos of the 1990s to purchase a controlling stake in Sibneft, a large Russian oil company, in a rigged auction. Similarly, corrupt methods were used to acquire huge stakes in metal companies and other resources. He eventually sold Sibneft to the Russian government in 2005 for $13 billion. In this way, scores of oligarchs emerged in Russia in the 1990s and early 2000s. Prigozhin's ascent was not as dramatic as Abramovich's, but it was highly successful nonetheless. It stemmed to a considerable degree from his developing catering empire. In addition to his hot dog kiosks and catering company, he opened the Vinny Club Bar and Store on Vasilevsky Island in St. Petersburg in 1995. A year later, he founded Concord Management and Consulting, a culinary and catering empire which grew exponentially in the second half of the 1990s and early 2000s. For instance, within a few months, it consisted of at least 10 restaurants, 20 different fast food companies, catering divisions, and even a construction arm to build restaurants and other commercial ventures. An indication of the manner in which Prigozhin quickly began branching out into other areas of enterprise after his catering business began to produce enough capital. And there certainly was enough capital. By the spring of 1998, Concord Management and Catering was turning over more than $1 million in profit every month. And by the end of the 1990s, the company had acquired contracts to begin catering to government events in St. Petersburg and Moscow. It was in this manner that Prigozhin would cultivate a relationship with Vladimir Putin. Putin was a former KGB agent who had served in East Germany and reportedly also in New Zealand during the 1980s before returning to St. Petersburg at the end of the Cold War to begin a political career. There he rose rapidly after acquiring a position in Yeltsin's administration, first becoming head of the Federal Security Bureau, then the Secretary of the Security Council of Russia, and finally gaining appointment as Prime Minister and Yeltsin's approval as his designated successor. Thus, when Yeltsin announced his intention to retire on New Year's Eve 1999, he appointed Putin as his interim successor. He formally became president of the Russian Federation in May 2000, and has held power in Russia, albeit with different titles, ever since. The exact circumstances of Putin and Prigozhin's first meeting are unclear, but it seems probable that they first crossed paths in St. Petersburg at some point in the mid-1990s, after Putin began frequenting one of Prigozhin's restaurants. He might well have facilitated the expansion of Prigozhin's catering empire in the years that followed through some political favors. What is clear is that the two were well acquainted by the end of the 1990s, by which time Prigozhin's restaurants were regular haunts of Putin and other senior Russian political figures, notably the Staraya Tamozhnya restaurant, which Prigozhin opened in 1996, and which was for a time known as the foremost elite restaurant in St. Petersburg. In time, Prigozhin would come to refer to Putin as Papa, while the caterer himself became known colloquially within politically informed circles in St. Petersburg and Moscow as Putin's chef. Clearly, the two men, who had both grown up in St. Petersburg when it was Leningrad and had lived two murky, if different, lives in the last decade of communism, one as a spy and one as a prisoner, liked each other, and Prigozhin would prosper the more powerful Putin became. This growing influence, which Prigozhin held in the early 2000s, as Putin became the ruler of Russia, was symbolized by the New Island restaurant, which he opened on the waters of St. Petersburg on a modified motor ship. Inspired by the idea of floating boat restaurants on the River Seine in Paris, the floating restaurant had immediately become fashionable upon its opening in 1998. Beginning in the summer of 2001, when Prigozhin hosted a state dinner there to honor the French President Jacques Chirac's visit to Russia, the New Island restaurant became a regular venue for the hosting of state visits to Russia. The list of those who Putin wined and dined there and in his other restaurants, often with Prigozhin photographed at these events, included US President George W. Bush, the British Prime Minister Tony Blair, former US President Bill Clinton, Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi, the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party for a decade prior to the rise of Xi Jinping, Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping himself later on, the long-serving German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Is not just that it evinces a close relationship between Putin and Prigozhin, or the Russian leader's taste for the food served in Prigozhin's restaurants, but also that he trusted Prigozhin on security matters, as these were state functions where security was of the utmost importance. This would take on an even greater relevance in due course. The 2000s saw Prigozhin's wealth and influence expand enormously as Putin tightened his control over all aspects of Russian politics and society. Concord Management and Consulting became the foremost catering company in the entire country at this time, as Prigozhin was awarded a number of lucrative contracts to mass supply food to Russian schools, the military and other establishments. This eventually expanded to supplying a wide range of other products to the Russian education sector, culminating ultimately in a mass outbreak of dysentery in Russian schools in 2019, linked to catering contracts given to Prigozhin. His construction empire also expanded as he moved into building entire residential units in Russian cities and towns. While as early as the mid-1990s, he was involved in the casino industry. What all of this ensured was that Prigozhin was a vastly wealthy man by the early 2010s. His wealth was eventually estimated at over $1 billion. But it is very difficult to put an exact figure on this. For instance, later searches of his office in St. Petersburg in 2023 revealed him to have had boxes full of tens of millions of dollars worth of rubles on site. And, like all Russian oligarchs, his business affairs were not entirely transparent, perhaps involving money hidden overseas through shell companies. Moreover, his assets were vast, most notably his mansion near St. Petersburg and a small fleet of private jets and yachts. His family also flourished. His wife, Lyubov, for instance, started a number of businesses herself eventually, including a fashionable spa in St. Petersburg and several hotels, while Prigozhin's mother, Violetta, founded the Colors of Life Art Support Fund, which was widely considered to be established for a mix of covert financial reasons and as a wing of Russian state propaganda. If there was a point at which Prigozhin moved from being a food caterer turned business magnate and state agent to a political figure within the Russian Federation in his own right, then it surely came in 2013. This was the year in which, by his own admission, Prigozhin established the Internet Research Agency. The name sounds more benign than it in fact was. What the IRA, or Glavset as it is often referred to in Russia, aimed to do was to exploit the rapid emergence of social media and similar new internet phenomena since the mid-2000s to begin influencing world politics in ways which favored Russia. Effectively, this was the idea of establishing troll farms that would set up thousands of bogus accounts on leading social media and internet communications platforms such as Facebook and X, formerly Twitter, and using these to begin trying to spread misinformation in order to create political instability in countries like the United States. The concept of troll farms is well established in the 2020s, but when Prigozhin seems to have concocted the idea for the Internet Research Agency and set it up with Putin's support in 2013, it was a relatively novel concept. While Prigozhin had established himself as a major figure within Russia itself, in the early 2000s and early 2010s, he was still a relatively unknown figure on the global stage until 2014, the year that Russia began its attacks on its western neighbor, Ukraine. Ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, Ukraine had been an independent country, though one which had a volatile political system. There were two factions in Ukraine, one which wanted to maintain close ties with Russia, and another which looked westwards to Europe and the United States. The president of Ukraine from 2010 to 2014, Viktor Yanukovych, tended to lean towards Moscow. It was his decision in 2013 to refuse to sign the European Union-Ukraine Association, which led to the Maidan uprising in Kyiv that November. Over the next 3 months, a pro-EU faction overthrew Yanukovych and brought Ukraine politically closer to its western neighbors. This led Putin to launch an invasion of Ukraine in February 2014, following which the Crimean Peninsula was annexed by Russia, and two breakaway puppet republics, the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, were effectively set up in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine under Russian administrators. This initial invasion of Ukraine, though, was localized to the east of the country, and at this juncture, Putin maintained that he was simply looking to retain control of the Crimea and Donbass regions, which he claimed were historically part of Russia. A limited conflict raged on in the east of Ukraine for the next 8 years, even as sporadic peace negotiations were carried out in Minsk, the capital of Belarus. In response to the invasion of eastern Ukraine and annexation of Crimea in early 2014, Prigozhin entered into privatized military activity, the initiative he would ultimately become most known for. Exactly who founded the organization known as the Wagner Group at this time is a matter of some debate. Some believe Prigozhin did, but others believe that it was Dmitry Utkin, and that Prigozhin quickly became involved and began using his extensive political influence and financing to develop it further. It may well have been Utkin, a former intelligence agent who went by the codename Wagner on occasion, after the German composer Richard Wagner, a name which Utkin had allegedly adopted owing to the Nazi leader Adolf Hitler having considered Wagner the greatest of German composers, an affinity which Utkin, a pronounced fascist and racial ideologue, apparently shared. Whether it was Utkin or Prigozhin that first set up the Wagner Group is relatively immaterial. Within months, it was largely being driven by Prigozhin, with Utkin as his second in command, and was a mercenary group designed to be deployed in regions where Putin did not want the fingerprints of the official Russian military to be too obvious. The Wagner Group was first employed in eastern Ukraine in the Donbass region, in large part because Putin was trying to pretend that the fighters here were native separatists, rather than being largely Russian agents. Here in the mid-2010s, Wagner operatives were given select missions to track down and kill pro-Ukrainian elements within the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, as well as several local commanders who had initially sided with Russia in early 2014, but who had become overly independent in the interim period. The group was also involved in the Battle of Debaltseve in the Donetsk Oblast in late January and early February 2015. Yet the group remained relatively small at this juncture. Even by early 2016, it was believed to consist of no more than about 1,000 personnel, many of which were trained at a Russian military of defense installation at Krasnodar Krai in the southwest of Russia, not far from the fighting in Ukraine. Thus, at this juncture, the group remained a small mercenary outfit who were contracted as military experts to carry out precise missions as a special operatives group. That remit began to expand, though, in the late 2010s, as Wagner's funding and size increased. By the end of the decade, it would have close to 10,000 operatives, some with an international dimension, such as the Serbian Brigade, coming from a country which has maintained historically close ties to Russia since the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s. The increased size of Wagner from the mid-2010s onwards saw it playing a growing role in other parts of the world where Russia had national interests. One such area was Syria. One of the bitterest civil wars in modern history had been raging there since 2011, with Putin looking to support President Bashar al-Assad as a regional ally. Wagner was involved in activities in Syria by the autumn of 2015, as Russia sought to intervene directly in the conflict on behalf of Assad. Much of this involved fighting in Iraq and Syria against the Islamic State, which had claimed control over large parts of those two countries in the mid-2010s. The Wagner Group was still carrying out missions in this conflict as late as 2021, as Assad and the government had gained the upper hand and were beginning to reclaim control of much of the country. Wagner units possibly clashed with US special operatives at the Battle of Hasham in February 2018, but the incident did not lead to major diplomatic unrest. It underlined the value of Wagner as a mercenary group that the Russian government could claim it was not responsible for. Otherwise, the events at Hasham might have constituted a direct engagement between the US and Russian militaries. Wagner's activities in Africa have been even more substantial than in Syria. Since 2017, Prigozhin has sent Wagner units into numerous African countries and used them to negotiate with either governments there or factions that have sought to claim control over countries across the continent. This activity has been concentrated to a great extent on the Sahel region lying along the southern stretches of the Sahara Desert, notably in Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, Niger, the Central African Republic, Sudan and South Sudan, a string of contiguous countries covering a vast part of the continent. It has provided a range of services there, some being the provision of security to governments or the training of military units at a time when the Sahel has become dangerously destabilized. They have also acted as mercenaries guarding valuable gold, diamond and uranium mines across the region, while Wagner has also become a profitable enterprise by involving itself in mineral extraction here. Wagner's role has ultimately been a nefarious one, destabilizing the region further and promoting growing militarization and political instability, while numerous war crimes are attributed to Wagner groups there. Further afield in Africa, Wagner has also been active in Libya as part of its interminable civil war and discord since the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. Elsewhere, defense contracts have been acquired by Wagner in Mozambique and Madagascar. It should be noted that these are often in bids against American private security firms, like the US Academy, formerly known as Blackwater. Wagner usually seeks to outbid these other companies when Russian interests are involved, such as in Madagascar, where Russian firms were bidding to gain controlling influences over the mining of chromite and other minerals in that country. Indeed, even within Russia, a country where criticism of the government and its allies is restricted, but not unheard of, there were reports on his activities and criticism of him from a number of outlets and individuals in the second half of the 2010s. As his profile expanded, so too did the number of sanctions being issued against him. For instance, in 2017, international sanctions were issued against his biggest company, Concord Management and Consulting, while a wide range of further sanctions were issued by the US government against companies Prigozhin was suspected of owning or having a controlling influence over, notably Evropolis Limited, a company which was involved in protecting and aiding the movement of Syrian oil consignments out of the country and onto the foreign market, activity which seems to have been an offshoot of Wagner's involvement in Syria from 2015 onwards. Sanctions followed from a great many other countries, in large part owing to the actions of the Internet Research Agency, with governments across Europe, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and further afield claiming that Prigozhin's troll farms tried to influence public opinion and the results of elections in their countries. As important a figure as Prigozhin had become in Russia, and as notorious as he increasingly was abroad, both for the Wagner Group's activities in Syria and Africa, and for the Internet Research Agency's meddling in foreign elections, Prigozhin only really emerged as a household name globally following the expansion of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in the spring of 2022. While a low-level war had been underway between the governments of Ukraine and Russia in the eastern part of Ukraine, the Donbass, since 2014, Putin had become determined to expand the war in the early 2020s. Much of this was on the back of growing negotiations between Ukraine and several Western states about the possibility of Ukraine joining the US-led North American Treaty Organization, or NATO as it is more commonly called. In late 2021, US intelligence services began to report that they were seeing increased military buildups by the Russian Federation along the border with Ukraine. These were on such a scale by early 2022 that it was clear to many in Washington that Putin now intended to expand the war against Ukraine, sending the Russian military directly into the region, rather than largely using proxies as they had done since 2014, and also expanding the nature of the war to strike at Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital, in an effort to effectively take over Ukraine again. Intelligence services were not wrong, and after several public broadcasts in which he sought to justify Russian aggression, Putin launched an expanded invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022. It did not go according to plan though, and in the weeks that followed, the Russian armed forces failed to take Kyiv and became bogged down in fierce fighting across eastern Ukraine. The result is a bitter war, which looks set to drag on for many years to come. With the expansion of the war against Ukraine, Wagner's role yet again increased, and with it Prigozhin's profile and influence. At first, hundreds of Wagner operatives were sent to the Russian front near the border with Ukraine, often charged with overseeing units of the standard Russian military, effectively providing training much like they had been doing for several African governments over the past years. But as the initial swift victory, which Putin and his ministers had been hoping for, failed to materialize in the course of the spring and summer of 2022, and the Ukrainians even launched counterattacks on a number of fronts, more and more Wagner units were sent to Ukraine. By the second half of 2022, Prigozhin was trying to recruit thousands more troops, and eventually over time, Wagner's numbers swelled into the tens of thousands. As this occurred, Wagner morphed from being a small mercenary group commanding a few thousand well-trained special operatives into a small subsection of the Russian army, with Wagner units effectively leading the fighting in a number of the most contested towns and regions of the long war front with Ukraine. Wagner's growing involvement in the war was most clearly on display in the battle for Bakhmut, a town in the Donetsk region of eastern Ukraine, where some of the most intense fighting of the war between Russia and Ukraine has occurred. The Russian military advanced towards Bakhmut in early August 2022, with the goal of seizing it after weeks of heavy artillery shelling. It became a focal point for the war in the year that followed, with Wagner units leading the Russian effort and doing much of the fighting. The exact size of the forces involved on both sides has been contested, with both the Russians and Ukrainians underestimating the size of the enemy army and overstating their own forces for the purposes of army morale. But it is clear that Wagner committed tens of thousands of men to the fight for Bakhmut between August 2022 and May 2023. Tens of thousands of casualties killed and wounded were suffered on both sides, culminating ultimately in what seemed like a victory for Wagner in May 2023, until the Ukrainian counteroffensive recommenced fighting that summer around Bakhmut, a town and region which has little strategic significance for either side, but which has become symbolic of the wider war, and which neither side feels can be totally given up to the enemy. One might ask where all Wagner's recruits were coming from to mount offences such as that seen in Bakhmut in 2022 and 2023. As Wagner's role in the war in Ukraine increased, its sheer number of mercenaries expanded proportionally, particularly so in the course of the second half of 2022 and first months of 2023. As this occurred, Prigozhin developed a new approach towards recruitment. While the mainstream Russian military was depending on conscripts from civilian society, many of whom did not want to be involved in the war, Prigozhin would recruit soldiers from Russia's prisons. The arrangement was that hardened convicts, some serving life sentences or decades in jail for murder or other serious and violent crimes, would be offered early release in return for fighting for a set period of 6 months with Wagner on the front lines in Ukraine. Prigozhin was seen himself visiting prisons, where he gave speeches to massed groups of prisoners, playing on his own experience of being in jail back in the 1980s. These offers proved attractive, and in the course of 2022 and 2023, Wagner's forces expanded into the tens of thousands, with its units proving far more effective in the war than the average detachment of the Russian military. But this is creating a clear problem for Russian society as a whole, as violent individuals, many of them murderers who had been sentenced to decades in prison, are returning to Russian society with large payments for their service after serving with Wagner, often to unleash a new wave of crime on their neighbors back home, and often seek reprisals against those who might have testified against them in court before they went to prison in the first place. Reports of serious crimes being committed around Russia by returned former convicts who had their prison sentences commuted for serving with Wagner for 6 months have begun to mount. It probably comes as little surprise that Prigozhin and Wagner were also engaging in a growing number of war crimes as the mercenary unit expanded. This was already occurring prior to the expansion of the war in Ukraine in 2022. As early as 2017, there were reports of Wagner war crimes being committed in Ukraine. In Africa, the group has been implicated in a wide range of atrocities. For instance, a Wagner division first arrived in Mali in December 2021, after agreeing a security contract with the government there. In the first 3 months of 2022 alone, right after Wagner arrived, the number of civilian deaths in Mali owing to internecine conflict and civil war surpassed the total figure for 2021 altogether. The most notorious incident occurred in late March 2022, when 300 civilians were massacred by Wagner troops, in conjunction with the Malian armed forces in the town of Moura. Similar atrocities have been carried out in other parts of Africa and in Syria by Wagner. Unsurprisingly, similar conduct has been reported in Ukraine in 2022 and 2023. There are widespread reports of Wagner soldiers summarily executing Ukrainian prisoners of war, torturing others, and throwing grenades at wounded prisoners of war. Civilian atrocities have also occurred. Prigozhin was undoubtedly culpable for this. Not only was he effectively in charge of the Wagner group while all of these war crimes were being carried out by his men, but in the case of the widespread incidents being reported in eastern Ukraine in 2022 and 2023, Prigozhin was at the front himself, effectively overseeing Wagner's movements from nearby. Unlike in Africa, where he might have been able to plausibly deny commanding his men to commit such acts, in Ukraine there is no doubt that he was responsible for such war atrocities committed by Wagner. As a result, by 2023, there were growing calls internationally for him to be charged and prosecuted with war crimes if ever he was captured in Ukraine or elsewhere. In the course of the first 6 months of 2023, Prigozhin continued to generate headlines, not just in Russia, but further afield. And this was not solely owing to the increasingly central role played by Wagner forces in Bakhmut and elsewhere in Ukraine. Much of it was owing to Prigozhin's growing criticism of the Russian war effort. Through recorded video statements released online and a variety of other mechanisms, Prigozhin was especially critical of Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister and the man effectively in control of overseeing the day-to-day organization of the war effort. For instance, Prigozhin criticized the lack of supplies being sent to the front lines, a deficit of hardware and machinery, and also the poor state of the rank and file of the Russian army, many of which were raw recruits who were either poorly trained or displayed no real zeal for fighting Ukraine. International observers originally believed that Prigozhin was acting in accord with Putin in making these criticisms, that it was simply Prigozhin acting as a proxy of the Russian leader to try to place pressure on the standard Russian military and the manner in which the war was being carried out. But in the course of the spring, and especially into the early summer of 2023, as the criticism became more and more frequent and condemnatory, many began to speculate that Prigozhin was acting independently, but this was viewed as being impossible in some circles. After all, critics of Vladimir Putin usually found themselves poisoned or sentenced to decades in prison somewhere in Siberia before long. Surely Prigozhin would not be acting against him. For those who were perplexed by Prigozhin's behavior in 2023, things were cast into sharp relief on the 23rd of June 2023. The Wagner leader had evidently been planning an insurrection or mutiny for several weeks. As intelligence services internationally later revealed, a troop build-up by Wagner in the region around Rostov-on-Don, the southern main command of the Russian military during the invasion of Ukraine. This may have been in response to growing concerns held by Prigozhin that Putin had decided that Wagner had become too powerful and intended to begin dismantling Prigozhin's control of it and amalgamating the group into the Russian military. However, Prigozhin would claim that the insurrection which he launched on the 23rd of June was incited by a friendly fire missile bombing of a Wagner military installation by the Russian army. This triggered him to release a video claiming that he had seized control of Rostov-on-Don and was sending troops north to Moscow to determine what was going on with the management of the war from Moscow. He directed his ire primarily at Defense Minister Shoigu in this video and avoided criticizing either Putin or the military's chief of the general staff, Valery Gerasimov, perhaps hoping to win over Gerasimov to his cause. With that, a large convoy of Wagner troops headed north for Moscow. Prigozhin himself remained in Rostov-on-Don. The whole world wondered what would happen next, as one of the most bizarre episodes in modern Russian history unfolded. On the morning of the 24th of June, Putin made a national broadcast in which he made absolutely clear that he had no intention of tolerating Prigozhin's mutiny, referring to those who were involved as enemies of the state. Prigozhin's major mistake in all of this was his claim in the video released the day beforehand that the expansion of the war against Ukraine in the spring of 2022 had been initiated on false premises, whereby the Russian people had been lied to about so-called Nazi elements within Ukraine, who posed a danger to Russia itself. This called into question Putin's own leadership. While the Wagner convoy on the way to Moscow had been reported by that time as having attacked and shot down Russian military helicopters, that afternoon many things apparently happened behind the scenes, out of view of the international news stations scrambling to report on the convoy's rapid drive north towards Moscow and the setting up of military stations south of the city. Then, all of a sudden, the would-be mutiny ended. The dictator of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, released statements declaring that he had personally brokered a deal with Prigozhin and that the Wagner leader had told his men to stop their movement towards Moscow and return to Rostov-on-Don. In what appeared to be one of the strangest political decisions of the 21st century, Prigozhin had apparently agreed to take his Wagner detachments into exile in Belarus, seemingly unconcerned with the fact that Putin notoriously nearly always tried to kill those who had betrayed him or moved against him. Surely, many speculated, Prigozhin was now living on borrowed time. The days and weeks that followed saw widespread speculation about Prigozhin's whereabouts. He was seen pulling out of Rostov-on-Don on the night of the 24th of June, just hours after calling off the mutiny, as he and his troops were loudly cheered by locals, a sign of the Wagner leader's popularity in Russia by then, but there was silence thereafter, although news outlets were able to report that military camps were being set up on the southern borders of Belarus for Wagner's detachments. Many assumed that there was now a risk that Wagner and Prigozhin would operate from southern Belarus and would pose a threat to Ukraine and specifically the city of Kyiv, or even neighboring Poland. But this never materialized. Instead, it appeared that Prigozhin would begin focusing yet again on Africa, as a series of events in the Sahel region destabilized it, notably a coup d'etat in Niger on the 26th of July 2023. 2 days later, Prigozhin was sighted in St. Petersburg, attending the 2023 Russia-Africa Summit. during the course of which Prigozhin met with several African leaders and affirmed his commitment to the region. All of this was bizarre in some sense. Surely Putin was furious with his erstwhile protege for the rebellion he had attempted a month earlier and would soon seek vengeance. Such speculation was well-founded. 2 months after Prigozhin's aborted mutiny, even as many continued to speculate on what role the Wagner leader would play in Russian affairs going forward, news broke on the 23rd of August 2023 that a plane on which Prigozhin had been traveling, according to the passenger manifesto, had crashed near Tver in Russia whilst flying between Moscow and St. Petersburg. Over the next several hours, news stations speculated as to whether or not he was on the flight, and if so, if the plane had been brought down in some fashion on the orders of Vladimir Putin. By the 24th, it had been all but confirmed that Prigozhin was on the plane, and he was presumed dead as reports filtered in of the recovery of his body from the wreckage site. While on the 27th of August, a genetic test of the remains confirmed his death. The Russian government offered little by way of information in the aftermath of the crash, adding speculation that the flight was intentionally brought down by the government. As footage emerged of the plane descending quite dramatically from the sky, and as reports came in on the parts of the plane being found several kilometers apart, it was reported that the most likely cause of the crash was an explosion on the plane while it was traveling in mid-air, not the use of a surface-to-air missile, but likely a bomb or explosive placed on the plane before takeoff. Although the Kremlin has denied it, the widely held view in international circles is that Putin had seen to it that Prigozhin was killed, symbolically exactly 2 months to the day after his mutiny in Rostov-on-Don. He was buried without a military or state funeral of any kind, in a low-key affair in a St. Petersburg cemetery on the 29th of August, with the Russian government eager to pass over the event with little fanfare. In the days following Prigozhin's death, there was wide speculation as to what would now happen to the Wagner group. The flight, which came down near Tver, had 10 crew and passengers on board. Amongst these were Dmitry Utkin and Valery Chekalov, the 2 most senior commanders of the mercenary group, and so it had been entirely robbed of its leadership cadre. Yet Putin was unwilling to disband such a useful organization entirely, and on the 25th of August it was announced that it would remain in arms. But all members of the group would henceforth be required to swear a new oath of allegiance to Russia, while the Belarusian dictator Lukashenko also confirmed that those Wagner forces which had already made their way to Belarus would remain in arms there for the time being. Thus, while the future of the group is unclear, it seems clear that they will continue to play a role in both the war in Ukraine and across regions such as the Sahel in Africa. Yevgeny Prigozhin was a most unusual byproduct of modern Russian history. On the one hand, his rise to riches and power is symptomatic of the rise of the oligarchs and the emergence of a new Russian Federation in all its corruption. A criminal, he managed to emerge as a wealthy businessman in the 1990s through graft and a ruthless determination to succeed, characteristics which drove many of the Russian oligarchs and Putin himself in the years following the collapse of the USSR. But where oligarchs like Roman Abramovich made their money in the 1990s and early 2000s, and then attempted to stay out of the way of the regime as much as possible, Prigozhin made himself indispensable to Putin, first as a caterer and then as a mercenary commander and political operative. His bloody behavior saw Wagner troops sow discord across many parts of Africa and implicated him in appalling human rights violations in Ukraine. But he remained untouchable while he still held the support of the Russian dictator, that he affectionately called Papa. But Prigozhin eventually became too big for his own boots. In the summer of 2023, after months of criticizing the conduct of the war in Ukraine, he launched a mutiny against Putin's government, only to abandon it the very next day. On the face of it, this seems to have been an absolutely suicidal move, when one considers the manner in which Putin has silenced all of his critics in Russia for the last 20 years, from the use of obscure poisons to interminable jail sentences. In Prigozhin's case, the method of choice seems to have been, perhaps intentionally conspicuously, an explosive on a plane. Thus, just 9 weeks after he crossed swords with the Russian dictator, Prigozhin was killed in the skies above Tver, bringing to an end one of the most unlikely careers in post-communist Russia. What do you think of Yevgeny Prigozhin? Do you think Vladimir Putin had him killed by sabotaging his flight?